The hidden threads of the White Tower. Every life has a story, but most are buried under the weight of stone and time. We like to believe that history is made of grand battles and gold crowns. But on this channel, we look for the hidden threads, the ones woven in the dark, through betrayal, pain, and the absolute limits of human power. Tonight, we aren't just visiting a fortress. We are descending into a machine designed to unravel the very soul. The Tower of London was never just a prison. It was a laboratory where the state tested how much a human heart could endure before it finally snapped. From the chilling precision of the rack to the silent tomb of the Little Ease. These are the stories of the men and women whose threads were stretched to the breaking point, yet somehow found a way to leave a mark. Before we pull back the veil on London's most notorious shadow, I want to invite you to join our journey. If you believe that every story deserves to be told, and you're ready to uncover the truths others look away from, hit the subscribe button and step into the threads of the past with me. Let's ensure these voices are finally heard. The iron-studded oak doors of the tower did not merely close. They sealed, vibrating with a finality that signaled the end of a prisoner's life as a creature of the sun. To step across that threshold was to enter a realm where the laws of the land were replaced by the whims of the crown and the cold precision of the interrogator. The descent began with the sensory stripping of the individual. As the dampness of the Thames seeped through the stone, the smell of salt and river mud gave way to the stagnant copper tang of old blood and the heavy, unwashed scent of human fear. The transition was immediate and total. A nobleman, once accustomed to the rustle of silk and the warmth of a hearth, now found his world reduced to the rough texture of granite and the rhythmic dripping of water from a vaulted ceiling. This was the first stage of the breaking process, the systematic removal of status, identity, and hope, leaving the prisoner with nothing but the echoing silence of their own heartbeat. In these lightless hollows, time lost all meaning. Without the rising of the sun or the tolling of city bells, a day could feel like a week. And an hour of anticipation could stretch into an eternity of dread. The prisoners were often kept in total darkness, a tactic designed to melt the resolve of even the most hardened conspirators. In this void, every sound was amplified, the distant scrape of a guard's boot, the rattle of a key in a lock several corridors away, or the muffled, unrecognizable cry of another soul in a neighboring cell. This psychological warfare was intentional. The goal was to make the prisoner crave the presence of another human being, even if that person was their executioner. By the time the heavy bolt finally slid back to signal the start of the interrogation, the mind had already begun to betray itself, conjuring horrors in the dark that were often more vivid than the iron instruments waiting in the chamber below. The question was rarely asked immediately. It was preceded by a walk through the darkness, guided only by the flickering orange glow of a torch that cast long, monstrous shadows against the weeping walls. The guards remained silent, their faces obscured by the gloom, acting as mere extensions of the stone itself. This walk served to remind the condemned that they were no longer in a world of men, but in a machine designed for extraction. Every turn in the labyrinthine corridors led deeper into the earth, further away from the mercy of the heavens. As the air grew thinner and the smell of soot from the braziers intensified, the prisoner would realize that they were being led to the heart of the fortress, a place where the king's justice was forged in fire and bone. It was here, in the flickering light of the torture chamber, that the silence of the cell would finally be shattered. The psychological pressure of the tower was not merely a byproduct of its architecture. It was a weapon sharpened by those who understood that the mind often breaks long before the skin is ever breached. For a prisoner like the young Jesuit priest John Gerard, the weight was a physical weight, a crushing pressure that sat upon the chest in the dead of night. The interrogators knew that isolation breeds a specific kind of madness, one where the victim begins to interrogate themselves, replaying their supposed crimes until the line between truth and coerced confession begins to blur. In the silence, the drip of water becomes a hammer blow, and the scurrying of rats in the straw feels like the approach of an army. This was the purgatory phase, a limbo where the crown waited for the soul to rot just enough that the sight of the rack would act as a final, merciful conclusion to the agony of uncertainty. When the summons finally came, it was often in the early hours of the morning, when the human spirit is at its lowest ebb and the blood is cold in the veins. The transition from the isolation of the cell to the activity of the torture chamber was a calculated shock to the nervous system. Suddenly, the prisoner was thrust into a room filled with the business of pain, the crackle of charcoal in a brazier, the metallic clinking of chains being oiled, and the presence of the lieutenant of the tower, seated behind a desk with a quill poised over a fresh sheet of parchment. There was no shouting, no chaotic violence. The process was terrifyingly orderly. The questions were asked with a soft, persistent civility that contrasted sharply with the jagged iron tools displayed on the walls, a reminder that the pain to follow was not personal, but a professional necessity of the state. This environment was designed to make the prisoner feel small, an insignificant speck of dust within the massive, uncaring machinery of the English monarchy. The stone walls of the tower did not just hold prisoners, they absorbed them. To look up at the soaring arches of the White Tower was to realize that thousands had stood where you now stood. And thousands had been forgotten. The interrogators would often remind their victims of this fact, whispering of those who had remained silent and died in the dark, their names erased from the ledgers of history. It was this realization, the crushing weight of an empire that could afford to wait forever, that finally shattered the resolve of the most defiant hearts before a single finger was ever laid upon them. At the center of the subterranean gloom sat the Duke of Exeter's daughter. A skeletal frame of oak and iron that had become the most feared symbol of royal displeasure in all of England. Known more commonly as the rack, this machine was a masterpiece of grim engineering. Designed with a single, horrific purpose, to turn the human body into a map of stretched tissue and displaced bone. When a prisoner was led toward it, the first thing they would notice was the smell, not just of damp wood, but of the heavy grease used to lubricate the winches and the faint, lingering scent of old sweat and iron. The victim was laid flat upon the frame, their wrists and ankles bound by thick hempen ropes attached to rollers at either end. In those final moments of stillness, as the executioner's assistants took their places at the levers, the sheer scale of the apparatus made the human form look fragile, like a piece of parchment about to be pulled taut. The agony of the rack was not a sudden explosion, but a slow, creeping crescendo. As the winches began to turn, the sound of the wooden gears clicking into place would fill the chamber, a rhythmic, mechanical counting of the seconds as the ropes grew tight. Initially, the sensation was merely one of intense pressure, as if the world were trying to pull the prisoner in two directions at once. But as the levers turned further, the pressure transformed into a searing heat. The muscles of the arms and legs would stretch to their absolute limit, screaming in protest as the fibers began to tear. It was a cold, calculated stretching of the anatomy, where the victim felt every inch of their own frame being elongated, the spine lengthening until the vertebrae began to pull apart with sickening, muffled pops that echoed against the stone walls. For those who endured the full measure of the rack, the experience was a total descent into a sensory hell where the body ceased to feel like a unified whole. One of the most famous victims, the poet and Jesuit martyr Robert Southwell, described a sensation where the limbs felt as though they were being ignited by an internal fire. When the joints finally surrendered, the noise was often compared to the snapping of dry kindling. Shoulders would slide from their sockets, and hips would dislocate with a violence that sent shocks of white hot lightning through the nervous system. Yet, the interrogators were careful. They would pause the turning of the wheels to ask their questions, allowing the prisoner to hang in that state of mid-extension, where every shallow breath was a battle against the weight of their own suspended body. This was the true horror of the Duke of Exeter's daughter. It turned time into a weapon. By holding a person at the brink of physical collapse, the torturers could strip away the layers of the soul until only the raw instinct to survive remained. It was said that many who were taken from the rack were never able to walk again, their ligaments so thoroughly ravaged that they became permanent invalids, their bodies forever reshaped by the daughter's cruel embrace. Even if they escaped the executioner's axe, they carried the tower's mark within their very marrow. A reminder that the crown could not only take a life but could fundamentally dismantle the vessel that held it. The cruelty of the rack was often amplified by the cold, clinical atmosphere of the room. This was not a place of chaotic rage, but of recorded procedure. As the prisoner's body was elongated, a clerk would sit nearby. his quill scratching rhythmically across paper, documenting every groan and every partial confession. This juxtaposition, the primitive violence of the wood and rope against the civilized bureaucracy of the state, created a surreal nightmare for the victim. For a man like Nicholas Owen, a master builder of priest holes, the rack was used with such relentless frequency that his internal organs eventually gave way. The sheer physical tension required to keep the body taut for hours meant that the pressure was not just on the limbs, but on the very heart and lungs. Breathing became a labored, agonizing chore, as the chest cavity was flattened and pulled, making every gasp for air feel like swallowing shards of glass. There were moments during the racking where the silence of the chamber was more terrifying than the noise. After a series of turns, the executioner might step away to consult with the lieutenant, leaving the prisoner suspended in a state of agonizing stillness. In this state, the gravity of the body itself became the torture. The weight of the hanging limbs pulled at the already shredded ligaments, and the lack of blood flow caused a deep, throbbing numbness that felt as though the hands and feet were being encased in ice. It was during these pauses that the psychological wall usually crumbled. The interrogators would lean in close, their voices hushed and almost sympathetic, offering a cup of water or a chair in exchange for a name, a date, or a location. They played the role of the rescuer from the very monster they had created. If a prisoner remained silent, the wheels would turn again. There was a point of no return on the rack, a threshold where the body was so thoroughly unmade that it ceased to be a functional human form. Survivors often spoke of a strange, outer body sensation, a mental flight from the physical wreckage being created on the oak frame. When the ropes were finally loosened, the collapse was total. The victim would fall onto the stone floor like a discarded suit of clothes, their limbs elongated and useless, their nervous system shattered by the trauma. They were then carried back to their cells, often in a basket or on a litter, to recover just enough strength so that the process could begin again the following day. This was the mercy of the tower, the preservation of life only so that the pain could be more thoroughly explored, while the rack sought to destroy the body by pulling it into the infinite. The device known as the scavenger's daughter achieved its horror through the opposite extreme: total, crushing compression. Invented by Sir Leonard Skeffington, a lieutenant of the tower whose name became synonymous with this iron nightmare. The apparatus was a jagged A-frame of cold metal. Unlike the rack, which required a team of men and a massive wooden stage, the scavenger's daughter was intimate and suffocating. The prisoner was forced to kneel on a small wooden beam while their body was folded forward, their head tucked toward their knees in a fetal position of forced submission. The iron bar was then brought down across the small of the back, and a screw was turned to pull the chest and thighs together until the human frame was locked into a tight, agonizing ball. The pain of this compression was a slow, internal catastrophe. As the iron frame tightened, the ribcage was forced inward against the lungs and heart, making every breath a shallow, frantic struggle against the unyielding metal. The pressure was so immense that it reversed the natural flow of the body's life force. Blood would begin to seep from the pores of the skin, and the intense force on the skull would cause hemorrhaging from the ears and nose. It was a form of torture that turned the victim's own anatomy against them, using the strength of their own skeleton to crush the soft organs within. Witnesses spoke of the sound of ribs cracking under the strain, a dull, wet snap that signaled the internal collapse of the prisoner's very ability to sustain life. But for those who were not destined for the iron frame, the tower held a different, perhaps more insidious form of torment: the cell known as Little Ease. Located deep within the flinty foundations of the White Tower, this was a chamber designed to deny the most basic of human comforts: posture. The room was a narrow, windowless stone box, roughly 4 feet square and 4 feet high. It was a space specifically engineered so that a grown man could neither stand upright nor lie down flat. To be cast into the Little Ease was to be sentenced to a permanent, agonizing crouch, where the muscles of the back and legs would eventually go into violent spasms of exhaustion. In the absolute darkness of the Little Ease, the prisoner became a prisoner of their own skin. The lack of movement caused the joints to seize and the limbs to swell, while the dampness of the stone invited a bone-deep chill that no amount of shivering could dispel. Days bled into nights, marked only by the agonizing cramp that traveled through the spine like a hot needle. It was a masterpiece of passive brutality. The tower did not need to strike the prisoner or stretch them on a wheel. It simply had to hold them in a position that the human body was never meant to endure, letting the weight of their own existence become an unbearable burden. By the time a man was dragged from the Little Ease, he was often a broken shell. His mind as cramped and distorted as the body that had been forced to inhabit the stone. The psychological toll of the scavenger's daughter and the Little Ease was often more enduring than the physical scarring. In the A-frame's grasp, the victim was reduced to a state of primal helplessness. Their face pressed against their own shins, unable to see their interrogators and forced to listen to the clinical discussion of their own breaking point. This forced posture was an intentional act of humiliation, stripping away the dignity of the prisoner before the final collapse. Because the device did not leave the obvious, ghastly wounds of the rack, it was often used on those whom the crown wished to break without leaving a public trail of mangled flesh. It was a cleaner torture, one that destroyed the internal machinery of the human spirit while leaving the outward appearance relatively intact, a terrifying efficiency that the tower's officials perfected over generations. Inside the Little Ease, the deprivation was of a different sort, the total erasure of the horizon. A human mind needs space to function, but within that 4-foot square tomb, the world shrunk to the distance between the nose and the freezing wall. Prisoners would often lose their sense of balance and direction, becoming so disoriented that they would hallucinate light or voices in the absolute void. The physical pain of the permanent crouch eventually gave way to a strange, detached delirium. When the guards finally opened the door, the sudden influx of light and the ability to straighten one's spine felt less like a relief and more like a fresh assault on the senses. The body, having adapted to its cramped prison, would often resist being unfolded, the muscles having locked into a permanent, defensive knot. These devices represented the dual nature of the tower's cruelty, the active and the passive. Whether it was the iron screw of the scavenger or the stone silence of the Little Ease, the message to the prisoner was the same: you are no longer a person with rights or a future. You are an object to be compressed, folded, and stored. The very air you breathe is a gift from the lieutenant, and the space you occupy is a privilege that can be retracted at any moment. For many who inhabited these depths, the transition from the active torture of the chambers to the passive torture of the cells was a cycle of never-ending dread, where even the absence of pain felt like a countdown to its inevitable return. To understand the true horror of the tower, one must look upward from the dungeons toward the lieutenant's house, a timber-framed Tudor building that sat in jarring comfort above the site of so much misery. Torture in the Tower of London was never a lawless act of passion. It was a deeply regulated, bureaucratic ritual of the state. In England, common law technically forbade torture, which meant that every time the rack was turned or the iron screw of the scavenger was tightened, it required a specific royal warrant, a letter of torture, signed by the Privy Council or the monarch themselves. This turned the pain of the prisoner into a clinical data point for the elite. While a victim screamed below, the lieutenant and his guests might be dining upstairs, the sounds of the dungeon muffled by thick stone and tapestries. A chilling reminder that for the powerful, human suffering was merely a necessary overhead of governance. The psychology of the interrogators was defined by a terrifying detachment. Men like Sir William Waad, a notorious lieutenant during the reign of James I, viewed themselves not as monsters, but as protectors of the realm. To them, the prisoner was a puzzle to be solved, a vessel containing hidden truths that belonged to the king. They used a technique often referred to as the gentle torture, which was a misnomer of the highest order. It involved a slow, psychological dismantling where the interrogator would act as a sympathetic father figure one moment and a cold judge the next. They would allow the prisoner to see the instruments of torture being cleaned and prepared, letting the sight of the blood-stained wood do the work of the blade. They understood that the anticipation of pain often cracked a mind more effectively than the pain itself, and they played upon the prisoner's isolation with surgical precision. This bureaucratic cruelty meant that the torture was often interrupted by long periods of silence and kindness. A prisoner might be given a better meal, a clean shirt, or a few moments of sunlight. only to be told that these comforts would continue if they simply provided a single name. This carrot and stick approach was designed to make the prisoner feel that their suffering was their own fault, a consequence of their stubbornness rather than the state's brutality. The lieutenant's house was the brain of the operation, where the raw data of screams was translated into the refined language of treason trials and execution orders. It was here that the decision was made on who would be broken and who would be allowed to merely rot. A game of political chess played with the nerves and sinews of the desperate. The most chilling aspect of this system was its ultimate goal, not just confession, but conversion. The state did not just want to know where the gold was hidden or who the conspirators were. They wanted the prisoner to admit the righteousness of the crown. By the time a victim reached the lieutenant's table to sign their confession, their hands often shaking so violently they could barely hold the quill, the victory was complete. It was a total colonization of the individual, where the state proved it owned not just the prisoner's body, but their very will. The tower was not just a prison, it was a factory where the human soul was processed, refined, and, if it could not be bent to the king's purpose, discarded into the lime pits of history. The atmosphere within the lieutenant's house was one of chilling domesticity, a place where the business of agony was discussed with the same measured tone one might use to discuss the grain harvest or the tax levy. The men who paced these upper floors, the lawyers, the secretaries, and the lords of the council, regarded the dungeons as a laboratory of truth. To them, the human body was a locked casket, and pain was simply the key. They developed a sophisticated language of euphemism to mask the carnage. They spoke of putting the question, or examining with more severity. Phrases that allowed them to maintain their self-image as civilized administrators while the reality of shattered bone lay just beneath their feet. This clinical distance was perhaps the most profound torture of all, for it signaled to the prisoner that their agony was not even a matter of anger, but of simple, cold utility. In this environment, the interrogation became a performance of power. The lieutenant would often bring high-ranking prisoners to his own dining room first, offering them wine and fine meats as a reminder of the life they were about to lose. It was a subtle, cruel display of what cooperation could buy. They would discuss the prisoner's family, their estates, and their legacy, weaving a web of domestic guilt around the victim's heart before the first descent into the dark. This psychological maneuvering ensured that when the prisoner finally heard the heavy thud of the dungeon door, the loss of their status felt like a physical amputation. The state didn't just want the truth, it wanted the prisoner to feel the absolute weight of their own insignificance in the face of the crown's divine right. The ultimate tragedy of the lieutenant's strategy was that it often produced truths that were entirely fabricated. Under the relentless pressure of the rack and the velvet-gloved threats of the interrogators, many prisoners would eventually say anything to make the world stop turning. They would invent conspiracies, implicate innocent friends, and sign their names to lies that would send others to the block. The lieutenant's house was thus a mill that ground human lives into the political currency of the day. By the time a prisoner was led out to face the crowd on Tower Hill, they were often a ghost of their former selves, their spirit having been methodically harvested in the rooms above the river, leaving only a hollow vessel to be broken by the executioner's axe. The Tower of London is more than a collection of limestone and mortar. It is a living sarcophagus that has preserved the despair of centuries within its very grain. As we move into the final chapter of this dark chronicle, we look beyond the instruments of iron and toward the scars left behind, the physical and spiritual remnants that still cling to the walls of the Beauchamp and Salt Towers. For those who survived the rack or the scavenger's daughter, the struggle did not end with the interrogation. Many were left to linger in a state of suspended animation, forbidden from seeing the sky and denied the mercy of a quick death. In their isolation, they turned to the only canvas they had left, the stone walls of their cells. These carvings, or graffiti, remain some of the most haunting artifacts of human endurance ever discovered. Etched with blunt nails or smuggled pieces of metal. To walk through these chambers today is to read a testament of the condemned. You see names, coats of arms, and religious symbols, but most strikingly, you see the philosophical reflections of men and women who knew they were being erased from the world. One prisoner carved the words, "The more suffering for Christ in this world, the more glory with Christ in the next." a desperate attempt to find meaning in the wreckage of his own body. These inscriptions were not mere vandalism, they were an act of rebellion against the lieutenant's silence. By carving their names into the rock, the prisoners were ensuring that even if their bodies were broken and their lives extinguished, the tower itself would be forced to remember them. The stone became a witness, absorbing the tears and the prayers of the broken until the fortress itself felt saturated with their presence. The legacy of the tower's dungeons eventually outlived the practices that made them famous. As the Enlightenment began to flicker in the distance, the letter of torture became a relic of a more barbaric age, and the rack was moved from the chamber to the museum. Yet, the atmosphere of the tower remains heavy, a lingering psychic weight that many visitors describe as a coldness that no summer sun can penetrate. We reflect on the ultimate irony of this place. A fortress built to protect the realm became the very site where the realm's most horrific acts were committed in the name of security. The suffering of the tower reminds us that the line between order and atrocity is often as thin as a royal warrant, and that the resilience of the human soul is capable of enduring even the most calculated attempts to dismantle it. As we conclude our descent into London's most notorious shadow, we are left with the echoes of those who stood where we now stand. The tower stands today not as a site of active horror, but as a monument to memory, a reminder of the cost of power and the price of dissent. The screams have long since faded into the fog of the Thames, but the lessons carved into the stone remain as sharp as the day they were first etched. We tell these stories not to dwell on the darkness, but to honor the light of the human spirit that refused to be extinguished, even in the deepest, most lightless hollows of the White Tower. The history of the tower is the history of us all, a story of tragedy, endurance, and the eternal search for truth in a world that often prefers the silence of the grave.